Hi, everybody. Welcome this evening to our friends here in Bangkok and to those tuning in from Australia. I appreciate it's getting late there and you're probably hungry and ready for dinner. So, we're going to jump right into our webinar this evening, Your Path to Australia. And we're going to be discussing how to bring friends and family to Australia, either to immigrate or to visit your fine country. So, before we begin, let's go to the next slide, Copter. We're going to take Q&A, and in order to do that, last webinar I gave you bad instructions. This time, go ahead and click on the question mark icon, Q&A, and go ahead and type in your question. We're going to address all of those at the end, and yeah, we'll be happy to answer those. The second thing is, don't feel like you have to take copious notes, even though we may be going over some things quickly. We're going to share the recording and it will be up on our website within a few days of this webinar, and you can view it at your leisure. And then finally, for all you fine folks who have tuned in this evening and are participating today, we're going to have a special bonus as a thank you for joining us. So let's dive right in. We're going to do some quick introductions. My name is Mark Friedman. I'm the managing director of Bond Thai. I'm an American lawyer based in Bangkok. I've been a member of the California Bar since 1987, and I lead Bond Thai's what we call the outbound team, which helps Thai nationals immigrate or visit abroad in countries like Australia, the UK, EU, America, and Canada. We are also members of the Australia Chamber, not only because of the excellent information that they provide for businesses in our community, but also it's a lot of fun to attend their events. Wilbert?
Hi, thank you, Mark, for that great introduction. So my name is Wilbert Briones. So I'm the one specializing for Australian immigration law for Bantai Immigration Solutions for several years now.
Great.
Okay, so what we'll be covering all throughout the session are the three following visas, and these are the visitor visa, Fiancé Visa, and the spouse visa. All right, just to explain with you the application process. Actually, Mark, Australian visa application is being done online, so there's no need for any physical documents. So what normally starts, we fill out the application form online, and then we actually pay the applicable visa fees for each type of visa. And then after everything has been uploaded online, we are actually scheduling the appointment for our clients to submit their biometrics at the Visa Application Center or VFS, because if there's no biometric submission, the visa application will commence assessment. Okay, and then after that, it goes to Home Affairs for the review. And after several weeks, depending on the type of visa application, we will be receiving an email, either to the applicant or to us, if the visa approved or denied.
And just a couple of questions for process, for my edification and our audience here. So the fee payment, can that be done by credit card or does that have to be done by bank transfer?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. So there are several payment options. So number one, you can pay via PayPal or credit or debit card.
Excellent. Yeah. And then for the VFS facilitation, you actually have to go in. Where in Bangkok is that located?
It's actually located in Ramanai.
Okay.
Yes.
And you say appointments. How far in advance does it typically take to get an appointment at VFS?
Actually, it varies day per day. It depends on the time of submission, but normally you can get an appointment as early as a week or two.
Okay, so it's not like the U.S. Embassy, which can be up to a couple of months.
I know it's not like that.
Much quicker.
Yes.
And is VFS a function of the Australian government?
No, it's actually not. It's a third party working on behalf of Australian Embassy or Home Affairs to accept the application or do some consular services for them.
Okay. And then my final question, Will, on the process piece is the visa approval or denial. How is that provided to the applicant, and does it contain reasons for the approval or denial?
Okay, that's actually a very good question as well, Mark. Since everything is online, it will be sent to the nominated email address, whether it's going to be their authorized recipient or the applicant. And then when it comes to denial, yes, they actually provide several reasons why the visa is being denied. For example, for visitor visa, they will enumerate those. And if you want to resubmit, there's a chance that as long as you address everything on it, there's a greater chance that the visa will be approved. As a matter of fact, we have an applicant like a couple of months ago, the visa was denied, and there are some instances that they're missing the application, but after we address everything, like after a week, it was approved, and they were very actually happy with the outcome of the application.
Excellent. And just to calibrate with everybody, if a U.S. visitor visa is denied, and we're going to get into the visitor visa in just a moment, the United States Embassy will not tell you any reasons whatsoever. You can always reapply again, but you don't know if you're addressing their concerns. I think the Australian system, frankly, is much more humane. And listen, if you've missed something in an application the first time and you can address it the second time, I think you can have some good success.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually also similar to the UK visa application process.
Okay. So let's give folks the bad news, at least when it comes to fees.
Okay, so when it comes to the fees, you're going to see there that the application for a visitor visa, it costs 195 Australian dollars, and they assess that between 2 to 4 weeks. And then the fiancé visa, it's actually being charged at 9,095 Australian dollars. Same goes with spouse visa for 9,095 Australian dollars. And the assessment is approximately between 16 to 24 months, but that actually depends at the time of submission, which we can always check online. So there are times that it's actually reduced to 18 months. So it depends on the influx of the application at the time of submission.
Got it. So demand may spike, and it could be a little longer. If demand is weaker and they have additional resources, it'll be less.
Exactly.
And just to calibrate here for just a moment, I know that the fees for fiancé and for spousal visas seem quite high. In most immigration offices around the world, the agencies are funded by dint of their fees. And essentially, if you're knocking on the door and asking to be admitted to the club, that's going to require that government to perform a great deal of due diligence, especially if you're looking at permanent residency. And that tends to be a self-funding exercise. It's the same thing in the United States. In fact, the United States just raised its USCIS fees. The UK fees are substantial. But essentially, the government is saying, if you want to join us, you have to pay to get in. So it is what it is. At the end of the day, though, if you want to become a permanent resident and move and be treated in a way that allows you to work and so on, these are the fees you'll have to pay.
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, in addition to that, speaking of spouse visa, I was actually surprised that the latest submission that we had, like we submitted the application last July of this year, and the visa was granted yesterday night. It was right in time of our webinar. Actually took less than 8 months for them to get approved. That's actually quite surprising.
Let's start with the visitor visa, the easiest to apply for, but maybe the most difficult to obtain.
I couldn't agree more, yes. For visitor visa, so normally it's for short-term purposes and for tourism and for leisure. And your intention should actually to either meet your family, to meet your parents, and anything that has not something to do with employment or such. Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to eligibility, you need to meet health requirements, character requirements. You need to possess sufficient funds and a genuine visitor to Australia.
So the health requirements, I would assume, would be about communicable diseases.
Exactly.
And is that self-reporting, or do you need to get a health certificate right away?
It's actually self-reporting. So based on the answers that will be provided on the application form, it will be the decision of the Home Affairs if you will be subject for health requirement.
Okay.
Yes.
And character, it's got to, I'm sure, have something to do with a criminal background. Does it also have to do with overstays and other sort of government missteps?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So that's why we counsel people try never to overstay a visa. Even here in Thailand, it's something that you may have to report later and it just sticks with you. And when you say sufficient funds, is there a particular amount or is it sufficient to pay for your visit?
Okay, actually, there's no particular amount that is prescribed as to how much would it be. So your fund should be sufficient enough to cover the expenses. So that will vary depending on if you have a sponsor, if you don't have a sponsor, if you have a prepaid accommodation. And so that's why it's very important to establish these facts before the visa gets submitted.
And when you talk about a sponsor, so you could either show funds in your Thai bank account if it's a Thai national apply.
Yes.
But if you have a sponsor, how does the sponsor represent to the Australian government that they're going to pay for everything?
That will be through a form of sponsorship letter and a bank statement.
Okay, so both would then be required.
Exactly.
A commitment to pay and then actually showing the ability to pay.
That's correct. Okay, so let's talk about the pros and cons of the visitor visa. So for visitor visa, you can stay up to 3 months. It can be single or multiple entry and may grant 12 months stay in certain circumstances. And for the cons, so it's challenging to obtain. Okay, so we overcoming the presumption of intent to violate, overstay, or work in Australia. And you can't stay in Australia longer by extending this visa. You must apply for another visa in Australia.
So I would tell everybody that this is very similar to the UK. It's very similar to the US. And based on a history of folks either overstaying or working on their tourist visa, governments are very sensitive for applicants from this part of the world applying. You can overcome the presumption. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But of the three visa types we're talking about today, where if you're an Australian citizen, you have the right to bring your family to Australia, you don't have a right to bring a visitor, and each application stands on its own, and it's entirely discretionary with the reviewing officer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then we talk about stay of different times. When is it that you're likely to get a shorter stay, and who gets these up to 12-month visas?
It actually depending on a lot of factors to consider, but based on my experience, I got an experience wherein they got a validity of 3 years.
Wow.
But they have been together for 5 or 7 years. So I think having longer relationship with the sponsor really matters when it comes to granting as to how long the visa validity will be.
And what about the status? For example, does it matter if they're married and they just want to get a visitor visa?
Yes, it's actually also one of the factors that they are considering when it comes to granting a longer visa validity.
Okay. So if you have a Thai spouse and you want to visit Australia and it's granted, it's more likely to be granted for a longer stay, so you can visit family and stay a bit longer in Australia than a shorter stay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So how do we overcome the presumption that the applicant intends to violate the visa day one?
Okay, so for overcoming the presumptions, history of honoring travel visas. For example, if you have traveled overseas and you have complied with the terms of your visa, especially if you have, let's say, Schengen visa, UK visa, and US visa, these visas are very tough to obtain. However, if you tend to violate those while you were staying there, chances are, even if you have been granted that visa, most likely you will be denied to enter Australia. So it's important that you will comply with the terms and conditions of your visa.
So basically what you're telling the Australian government is, I'm a trusted traveler overseas with various other countries, you can trust me to come to Australia. That's the headline.
That's correct. Because there are questions in the form that you were asked, where did you overstay your visa? So if you're not going to answer that correctly, they have means of checking that. So it's more on deception. So you might be banned on entering Australia. So we have to be as truthful as we are in answering the application form.
Great. Yeah. And then compelling reasons to return. I think we should address that a little bit. So what would you rank in terms of the best assurance to convince the Australian government that you will be coming back to Thailand?
Okay, this is actually a good question. So first one is having an employment or having a business. And then second, having family. So for example, if you have children below 18 years old, and if you have father and mother who are dependent on you, and then also property ownership. Okay. And lastly, international travel history. So these four factors, if you possess all of those, there's like a greater chance that your visa will be approved.
And we've had a success on the U.S. side with DS-160s, which is the form that you file with the U.S. Embassy, when we tell a cohesive story. And I think the same would be true for Australia. For example, if you're telling the Australian government you're coming back because of a job, having your employer say, look, there's a 2-week holiday coming now, and there's a cohesive story around the reason you're going for this period of time and needing to come back, it really works out. We had another woman who applied, had a good history of travel to Japan, had enrolled her child in a prestigious school here, and coincided her application and her request to go with the child's school holiday and got a letter from the school. So really what you're doing is you're telling the reviewing officer a complete story about why you're going, but why you need to come back, when, and tie all of that together. And I think that's the best way to approach it.
Yeah, that's correct. And to add about it, that it's about facts and evidence. These are the most important things we have to consider in visa application. The burden is on us to prove what we have stated in the application form.
And for example, for property ownership, title deed in the applicant's name. For business ownership, what they've done to capitalize and how much money they're making from the business, and paint a complete picture of that business or that property.
That is correct.
So let's move on. You've moved on from the friend stage to the fiancé stage. And the headline here is that you're much more certain to get an approval for this visa, but it's going to require some time, some energy, and a bigger investment. So let's talk about who this is for.
Okay, sure. The next type of visa category we have is Fiancé Visa. So with this particular visa, you must marry within 9 to 15 months from the visa grant date, or else the applicant has to go back to the country of where she resides. And then some of the requirements are genuine relationship with the sponsor and the applicant, and health requirement and character requirement too.
So again, with the health requirement, does this visa require a medical certification by a doctor, or does it depend on how they answer the questions?
That's actually the way they answer the questions in the questionnaire, and that would only be issued by accredited hospitals in the country of application. So you just can't go to a hospital of your choice. Home Affairs listed different accredited hospitals that you can only go to.
So if the Home Office says we want a certification, they will specify where to go.
That's correct, yes.
All right. And then the character requirement, again, in addition to, I assume, a criminal, and they're going to ask you to disclose any criminal convictions. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In most cases, both the applicants and the sponsors are required to submit the police check.
Okay. And then I think on the genuine relationship, this is, again, a common question for all countries where we represent clients. On family-based immigration matters, what the government's really trying to do is prevent fraud. That is, people that claim to form a relationship, but only for the purpose of attaining a visa. So the longer you're together, the more evidence you have of the genuineness of your relationship. That is, pictures, cards, telephone records. The more fulsome you can paint a picture of your history together, the better chances you have. And that's really, I think, in my view, the focus of most fiancé and spousal visas in Western countries. Is this a real relationship? How long has it been going on? How many times has this couple met face to face? And how much time have they really spent together? And what's the evidence, the documentation of that? Key piece.
That's correct. Okay, so when it comes to eligibility, so not had a visa canceled or an application refused, be outside Australia when you apply, sponsored by a fiancé, be the right age, have no debt to the Australian government, and sign the Australian value statement.
And what is the Australian value statement?
Okay, so yeah, that's correct. So the Australian value statement is a form applicants sign to agree to respect and follow Australia core values like freedom, equality, respect, and the rule of law while they are living or visiting Australia.
Excellent. And then I assume be the right age is age of minority. Would that be over 18 or 20, or what's the cutoff here?
18 years of age.
Okay. And then when you say sponsored by the fiance, is this a general agreement by the fiance to take care of all expenses, or is there an actual financial threshold like there is in the UK and the US?
There's none for Australia.
None.
Yes.
Okay. And because there's none, co-sponsorship isn't a thing with these as it is in the US.
There's none also co-sponsorship for Australian visa.
And does the Australian government do any sort of diligence around the fiance's ability to support the incoming Thai national?
They may be at the back end.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. That's different than a lot of other countries. It's a trust me moment, but again, that makes it a little more humane. Okay.
All right. So when it comes to pros and cons of these visas, for pros, you can switch to a family visa and easier to obtain than a visitor visa. And you can travel to and from Australia as many times as you want while you hold this particular visa. And you can work and study in Australia having this visa. For the cons, it's more scrutiny of the relationship as opposed to a visitor visa, and reapply for visa conversion after marriage and pay another visa fee.
So let's go to the pros for just a second. As I recall, you were saying they had to get married within 9 to 15 months, and that's 9 to 15 months of entry by the applicant into the country on the visa?
Yes, that's correct.
And during that entire time, they could go to school and work lawfully in the country.
Yes.
Different than many other countries. So is there a benefit to getting married sooner than waiting maybe for the whole 15 months?
Yes, so that you can prepare for the reapplication because for this particular visa, it's only limited for a certain number of months. So you don't want to rush things. Okay, so we actually suggest our clients that if they can get married as soon as possible so that we can easily prepare the next application for adjustment of status in Australia.
And so once they're married, then you let the Home Affairs Office, is that the correct?
Yes,
name?
that's correct.
You let them know, you provide their certificate of marriage. You said there's another fee to pay. How much is the fee to adjust the status?
It's around 1,015 Australian dollars, approximately that amount.
Okay, so it's not another 9,000 Australian dollars, but there is an adjustment of status fee.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to be exact, it's 1,515. Yes.
So just as you think about whether you want a spouse visa, which we're going to talk about in a minute, just know that on top of the 9,000 Australian dollars for the fiancé visa fee, there'll be another 1,500 Australian dollars.
That's correct.
To get to permanent residence. Okay.
All right, so the last visa category that we will discuss is the spouse visa. So this is a temporary visa that leads to permanent residency for married and de facto partner, and same focus as fiancé when it comes to the legitimacy of the relationship of the applicant and the sponsor.
They want to make sure this is a real marriage and not a marriage for purposes of solely for purposes of obtaining permanent residency in Australia, which again, around the world, this is going to be a focus of governments before they grant a spousal visa.
That's correct.
And can this eventually lead to Australian citizenship?
Yes, after obtaining the permanent residency. Yes.
And is there a time period, do you know?
It really varies. So I haven't experienced in the past for citizenship. It was more on the permanent residency side yet.
Okay. Great. So we talked about this first bullet point, not had a visa canceled or an application refused. If they had an application refused, for example, for a visitor visa, just because they couldn't overcome the presumption, is that a bar to getting a spousal visa?
Not necessarily, because it depends on the reason of refusal. If the reason of the refusal is not detrimental to the Australian government or such or similar to that, I don't think so that they will not allow you to resubmit your application for such particular visa.
Okay.
Yep.
And the visa cancellation means that you overstayed or worked or otherwise violated the terms of a private visa. Okay.
So with this visa, you need to be outside Australia when you apply and sponsored by your spouse.
Can I ask before there's a lot of, so I just want to catch these one at a time. When you say be outside of Australia, if you're a Thai national, does that mean you must apply in Thailand?
That's correct. Or your country of permanent residence.
Got it. So if you're a Thai passport holder, it's here, and then on Rama 9, you need to submit your biometric.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So going back, you have to meet the relationship requirements, the health requirement, and then the character requirement, and have no debt to the Australian government, and sign the Australian value statement, as we also discussed earlier with the Fiancé Visa.
And because this is unusual, much different than the UK and US and other Western countries, this sponsorship, there's no particular income level or money in the bank that the spouse needs to show, just a commitment that they're going to support the family. Is that correct?
Yes, there's not.
All right. And the health requirements, again, self-reporting. The character requirements are self-reporting. There is not a need to get a police clearance unless requested by the Home Affairs.
Yes, that's correct. All right, so for the pros and cons of this visa, so the pros is one-time application, okay, and leave work and study in Australia while permanent residency is being processed. Attend free language classes provided by the Adult Migrant English Program if eligible, and apply for access to Australia's public healthcare scheme, Medicare. And the cons is temporary visa until permanent residency gets granted.
So while you're on the temporary visa, though, you can still do all of these things. You can work, you can go to school. You're just waiting until there's an official change of status. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And actually, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, but actually had a client that around during COVID 2020. I was actually surprised that on the first application of the subclass 309 spouse visa, they automatically granted at the same time the permanent residency. So that actually quite surprising, maybe because during COVID or they have been in a relationship for almost, I think that was more 5 years. Yes.
Okay. And you say you can attend the free language class if eligible. Do you know what the eligibility is for that?
It really depends on the visa grant notice that they will be receiving. So all the information will be provided there. And they can also check on their online account as to what the eligibilities are once qualified.
And then as soon as they're granted a spousal visa, they're going to have access to Australian public health care, which is a huge benefit, right?
That's correct. Yes.
All right. And then when you apply for that adjustment of status, about how long does that take? You're granted the temporary visa until permanent residency is granted. What's the time frame?
It's between the 18 to 24 months time frame from the initial assessment of your spouse visa.
Okay.
Yes.
And then once you're granted permanent residency, you can start looking to citizenship.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I just want to tell people, Will has done a good job of covering the eligibility and the requirements. If you have a Thai friend or you have a Thai fiance and spouse, I think it's always good to do a little strategic planning, a little thinking. And even if you have a Thai friend that you think maybe someday, right, might become a fiance or a spouse, it's good to peek ahead. So for a Thai national who's never traveled overseas and it looks like it's going to be hard to overcome the presumption, maybe apply for a Schengen visa in one of the easier countries, or even a visa for Japan. I know you can go visa exempt, but they're right. But establish a pattern and a history of being a trusted traveler and then apply, which can be a lot of fun in the meantime. But do try to bolster your international travel history. And the other reason is to be thoughtful about how it is that you're going to tell the story about your reason to return. It could be bolstering bank account. It could be bolstering records around a business, a small business that you may be running, or taking care of family members and why you need to be the one that's doing that. And then for possible fiance or marriage visas, think about keeping good records now. It's not very romantic, right? To make sure you're taking pictures and keeping phone records and keeping records of all your text messages or your WhatsApp messages and so on. And it does require some foresight, some thought about that, but it's always a good idea. For example, if you're traveling together, keep your plane tickets, keep your hotel receipts, and do take lots and lots of pictures so that by the time you're ready to apply for either a fiance or marriage visa, you have this documented history, and then you or your representative can cull through that, because you don't want to dump a tome on the officers, but really show that over a period of time, 6 months, a year, 2 years, you were definitely together and this was a legitimate relationship. My advice to you is stay ahead of the process curve and just try to peek around those corners and create that history now, document that history now.
That's correct, Mark.
Okay. The things that Will talked about this evening, we have an Australia visa guide. Will is striving to be a trusted voice for Australia and UK and Schengen visas in the marketplace. It's an excellent guide. It's free to download, and you just go to this portion of our site, our resource guide, and feel free to download it. But that's not the bonus we alluded to at the beginning. The bonus we alluded to in the beginning is for anybody attending today, if you'd like to engage our help to file for a visitor visa or a fiancé or marriage visa, and you engage us before Santa has left your house by December 25th, we'll discount his fee by 10% for you as a thank you for your being here. Let's go into some questions now. And Olivier has asked, for the spouse visa, is there a minimum number of days we have to stay in Australia per year for the visa to remain valid? And that's an excellent question, Olivier.
Yeah, actually, Olivier, we have to get back to you on that to be precise with the answer. But as far as I know, there is always a number of days so that your spouse visa will be valid. But for the concrete details, we'll get back to you in your email for the answer.
All right.
Okay. And we have from Butchit, why do some people get 2 or 3 years visa validity while others only get 3 months? That's actually a very good question. So if I am to connect that to what we were discussing earlier, it depends on how long you've been together as partners in order for them to grant you a long-term visa validity. But in most cases, for example, if you've been together for around 5 or 6 years, they are granting you like 2 or 3 years visa validity based on my experience.
We have a question. I was denied a fiancé visa ex-partner a year ago. If I apply for a new visa with my new partner, is it recommended that I apply for the same type of visa, or should they not go with the fiancé visa and get married and apply for a spousal visa? Does that matter?
It doesn't matter, but we also have to base the documents that we will be presenting on the next application based on the reason of denial of the initial visa. So it's really circumstantial. So it's best that we have to see first what's the reason, and then we will plan what's the next course of action when submitting a new visa application with the new partner.
So I think you raised 2 good points. First of all of this is general information. We can't provide specific legal advice because everything depends on your particular circumstances. But the second thing I'd say to you is that generally when you're applying for a spouse visa, you're signaling to the Australian government, UK, US government that you've already committed to this relationship and you're seeking immediate immigrant status. And therefore, if you have some problems in your history, you're more likely to be granted a spousal visa than a non-immigrant fiancé visa. So again, when you're thinking through this and maybe you spent less time together, there's a big age difference, there might be something in the background that might call out more character, a spousal visa is more likely to be granted than a fiancé visa in those circumstances.
Yes, that's correct. And then we have a question here. Is there an expedited service for Australian visa application? Sorry, but actually there's none. Unlike for UK, there is, but for Australia, there's none. We have to follow the time frame that's published on the Home Affairs website.
And there isn't for the US as well, unless there's a humanitarian grounds, and that would have to be like an exigent medical circumstance. Does Australia recognize requests on humanitarian grounds?
I have not experienced similar thing in the past, but I guess maybe or maybe not. Okay.
Okay, we can look at that.
Yes, that's correct. And last question that we have here.
Sorry. Before we do that, I just think that the frame that we're talking about here, it seems like a long time frame.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar to the time frame that you'll experience if you're applying for a spousal visa in the US, because you're being granted permanent residency status. And what that means is the government's going to take its time and make sure it's engaged in a thorough due diligence process. It's going to really kick the tires and make sure it's a legitimate relationship. And there's nothing in the background here that they're allowing somebody to become a permanent resident that they'll later regret. It's hard to be patient, especially if you're a young couple in love, you've just married, and you want to be together as quickly as possible. It's just part of the planning you're going to need to do to think that this is going to be about a 16-month process. And by the way, to apply for permanent residency here in Thailand, it's 16 months to 2 years. So the timeline seems to be pretty consistent throughout the world, but that's just because you're seeking to become what I would call a member of the club without having been born into that club. Okay, thank you.
That's correct. All right, so we have a question here. Is there a way that I can stay longer than 90 days on Australia visit visa? So the answer may be or maybe not, but in most cases, you can. Because, for example, if you were granted, let's say, 1 year validity, so whenever you enter Australia, you are only allowed to stay 90 days. And then when that expires, you have to leave and come back again, and you will get another 90 days for such. But for example, let's say during your 90th day, you were hospitalized and you can't go and travel. So I think they may be considerable enough to extend your stay longer than 90 days. Yes.
And then if you have observed and honored the terms of your visa and you go apply for another visitor visa, is that helpful?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so create a good history. You'll have to go through the process again. Having gone through it once, you can anticipate what questions, what documents you need, and so on. So the application process will probably be easier. And by following those strictures, you're more likely to be granted another visitor visa into Australia. And if you want to visit the US as a Thai national or the UK, having that history in Australia will certainly be helpful. Do we have another question?
Sure.
If you sponsored someone previously and they were accepted as an Australian citizen, but have now finished the relationship, but have another friend wanting to come on a tourist visa, will this be a problem? It's a good question.
Yeah, I don't think there will be a problem for sponsoring a tourist visa. It's just only for the purpose of tourism.
Right. And again, for a tourist visa especially, you're talking about a limited time frame and limited resources. And frankly, and it's a little surprising to me that the Australian government doesn't have a specific bar like they do in the UK and in the US for how much you need to be showing in terms of income or assets. But we don't think that would be a problem. Okay, do we have any other questions?
There's a question here from Assistant Prof. Anusha. There is a visa for those with special knowledge and experience. Are you able to? As of the moment, we are actually focusing on family visas, okay? But for special visa category that you were mentioning, we can try to check on that and get back to the details with you via email.
Yeah. And so our firm at Bond Thai, which means, for the folks that are Thai already know this, it means Thai home. And so we do focus on family-based immigration. We don't, for example, at the moment, do work-based or education-based visas overseas. It's visitor visas, fiancé visas, and spousal visas is our area of specialty. However, we are members of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and AustCham, and through that, and with our APAC membership, we actually have colleagues in Australia. So if you ever need a referral for something that we don't handle, we would be happy to refer you to competent counsel with whom we interface regularly that are based in Australia.
That's correct.
Okay, any other questions? That's great. I know it's getting late in Australia. You're probably quite hungry. It's getting a little late here, although people tend to eat later here. We want to thank you again for your participation. 2 reminders. We're going to have a recording of this webinar up on our website in a few days. The other thing is you can always reach out to Will or another member of our team for a free consultation. You can do that through our website, and you can book that directly through our system, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you. It's difficult to answer some questions just because circumstances change or your particular circumstances may cause us to give you a different answer, but we're always happy to engage and have that conversation with you. And again, there would be no charge for that initial consultation. So thanks again. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Mark.
And thanks for our folks lurking here behind the screen, Copter and Champ, our Thai team here. And we look forward to seeing you during our next webinar. Have a nice evening. Take care.